All right, welcome everybody. While you're all filing in, I'll briefly go over some of the technical features of this platform before we start. All right, so I think enough people are in here. So welcome to today's coffee break. Before I hand it off to our moderator, I just want to cover a few differences between this platform, which is Zoom webinar, and a normal Zoom meeting or some other kind of virtual meeting software. First, your cameras and microphones are disabled by default, so you don't have to worry about interrupting us, but that does mean there's only a couple ways that you can interact and ask questions if you need to. So the first one is through the chat. If you want to have any kind of discussion or commentary, chat's great for that. Just make sure if you want everyone to see what you're writing, that you select all panelists and attendees from the dropdown. Otherwise, it will only be seen by the panelists. And then the second feature you can use is the Q&A feature. So for those questions there, if you have something related to the content, pop those in the Q&A. You can ask questions anonymously. And then everyone else can view those questions. They can add their own comments and you can even upvote them. So it's a much easier way for us to handle questions, especially when we have larger audiences like this. So without further ado, I want to hand it off to Melanie Gottlieb.
Thanks so much, Mike. Good afternoon and happy Friday. I'm Melanie Gottlieb, Deputy Director of Acro, and I'd like to welcome you to today's coffee break as a part of our fall series, which is an opportunity for Acro to discuss important and timely topics in a more casual and interactive environment. We know that you are all incredibly busy, and I thank you all for taking the time to join us this afternoon as you exit your week and enter your weekend. As always, we are hopeful that our technology will not fail us. This is a fairly large call, and like many of you, Acro remains working from home, and so we are at the mercies of our home Wi-Fi's. Hopefully it will all work. So far, we've been quite lucky. As Mike said, you can feel free to use the chat during the webinar. You may chat freely. If you have a question for the panelists, we would ask that you use the Q&A section to ask that question, and then we will get it into the Q&A at the end. Please note if the question is for a specific panelist that you say who that is for, identify the panelist in your question. So, joining me today are colleagues who represent the current situation in international recruitment from a multitude of viewpoints. First, we have Bryce Liu, Research Manager for World Education Services. We have Stacy Bernhardt, Manager of Global Recruitment and Operations at the FIU Chapman School of Business and also an Acro faculty member. Stacy Gustafson, Master of Education, Enrollment and Student Access Director at Montgomery College. Keela Hubbard, Director of International Student and Scholar Services at Wake Forest University. And Leah McCormick, Vice President of Eligibility Services and Business Development at the National Association of Intercollegiate Athletics, or NAIA, and also an Acro faculty member. Next slide. So today's agenda, I just want to share with you how we expect the conversation to go. I'm going to give some introductory remarks, and then I'm going to turn it over to Bryce, who will share some West survey data. Then we'll get into a panel discussion with all of our panelists, and then we'll move to Q&A. Next slide. Before we jump into the discussion, I want to direct you to our COVID practice pages. We've combined the resource and guidance pages that we had previously created into a single reference that includes all of our COVID-related guidance, endorsing alternative practices for institutions in this time of crisis. It's important to note that more than ever before, as you implement policy and practice changes, whether temporary or permanent, that you incorporate clear communication and transparency with all of your stakeholders, an approach that's consistent with your mission and your philosophy, and apply those very consistently in the best interests of your students and your campus. Next slide. I also would like to direct you, and the links are on those COVID resources, to our latest COVID Impact Practice Snapshot Survey. We did a series of them in the spring. The fall one really much more focuses on the professions, the professionals. So the ups and downs of organizational change management, institutional readiness, practice, and individual experiences for 2020. If you are looking to see if your institution is within the benchmark of our other member institutions, or how you are feeling as opposed to everyone else, I think you find some surprising results in there, so I would check it out. Next slide. Finally, before we turn it over to Bryce, if you have missed it, we have completely redesigned Acro Edge. Acro Edge provides valuable information to support institutional decision-making for international recruitment, admissions, academic placement, and the evaluation of international transfer credit. We launched the new design in July of 2020, and if you'd like a free trial, please email edge@acro.org, and we will set you up. I'm going to turn it over to Bryce now.
All right, thank you so much, Melanie. Give me just one sec so I can share my screen with everybody. All right, so I'm very happy to be here with everyone today, coming to you with some data that we have from World Education Services, or WES as we're sometimes known, on a series of surveys that we have done on the impact of COVID-19 on higher education, international higher education in the US. And this is just a sneak peek of some of the data that we have that's going to be released in a report most likely at the very end of this month. Just a little bit about WES, if you're not familiar with us. We're a nonprofit social enterprise. We work both in the United States and Canada. We're predominantly known, of course, as a credential evaluation organization, but we also have a lot of expertise in international higher education and skilled immigration. We work a lot with those who are internationally educated coming into North America, both students and professionals, and the institutions, organizations, and governments that work with them. This is just a little bit about me. I work with our research team. We do research on all sorts of different things, including quite a bit on international higher education in the US and Canada. And then today, what I'm going to just do very briefly is just give you a little bit of an introduction to the surveys that we've done, spend most of the time then talking about just some of the findings that we have, and then leave you with just a few recommendations before we turn it over to the panel. So just a little bit about the surveys themselves. We conducted 3 prospective student surveys in April, June, and August, all on COVID-19, and 2 surveys of higher education professionals in the US in April and June. What I'm going to do is just give you a little bit of the findings from June from June and August. The April results were released actually in a report earlier this summer on our website. If you go to wes.org/research, you can find it there. And the student surveys really were drawn from our credential evaluation applicants. They're all prospective students, meaning those who had not yet set foot on a US campus. And we really break it down by 2 important groups. One, of course, is international students. So those are students who are either outside or inside the US, but going to start a program on temporary status, usually, of course, a student visa. And then we also have internationally educated immigrants, who are those who have been educated outside of the US, but have come to the US, they're currently here, and they're on some sort of, for the most part, permanent status. So it can include permanent residents, sometimes US citizens, resettled refugees, and so forth. With the higher education professionals, these are individuals who work for US colleges and universities, either directly with international students and or with immigrant students. Okay, and then just some of the high-level findings, kind of broken down into two groups. One is just some of the plans that students in particular, and a little bit about kind of what institutions were planning for the fall term. And again, this is looking, for the students, this is looking at June and August, and for the institutions, this is looking at June. And this is just really a glimpse into what students were thinking heading into the fall term. And I think it's also really good to keep in mind, you know, as we head even beyond the fall term, as the pandemic will likely, I'm sure, continue into next year. So one of the first things that we asked students was, what is the impact of COVID-19 on their interest in studying in the US? And so we have the results broken down again by international students and immigrant students, as I'll call them for short. And then also broken down by the June respondents and the August respondents. So you can kind of see what the trajectory was over, you know, between those 2 months. And the good news appears to be that there's at least some continuing interest in the US. It's still pretty good, all things considered. In August, about half of all international students said that their interest in the US had not been impacted by COVID-19. It was even higher, of course, for immigrant students at about 2/3. Of course, there was also, as you can see with the blue bars, there was an uptick in the number of both international students and immigrant students who said they were less interested in studying in the US for probably somewhat obvious reasons. But there's also been at least a slight uptick among international students of those who are actually more interested in studying in the US, interestingly at about 22% in August. And that probably has to do with the situations in other countries. The National Student Clearinghouse actually just released some updated data yesterday about what actually enrollment looks like this term. And what they found is that there's been about a 14% drop in undergraduate international enrollment, and there's been about an 8% drop in graduate enrollment, just for comparison of what has actually happened as we know it so far this term. Now, we asked institutions what their plans were for the fall in terms of whether they were going to offer exclusively online learning or something else, a hybrid or on-campus learning. At the time, and this is back in June, 62% said they were unlikely to offer exclusively online learning, and about 30% saying that they likely would offer exclusively online learning. What we found so far in the higher education has actually been tracking this to a certain extent. They found about 44% of institutions term October are either fully or primarily online, and only 27% are fully or primarily in person, and about 21% are doing a hybrid. So we're skewing actually more toward about half of it most thing. And I apologize, I'm getting a note that my internet
So it seems like Bryce is having some internet issues. So let's give him just a moment.
Let me know when you can hear me.
You are back, Bryce.
Okay, sorry about that. I actually got a note on my end that my internet was a little bit unstable, so I apologize. This is the fun of working from home. So as I was saying, and I'm not sure where I cut out, about half of international students, prospective international students in August said that they would not enroll in online-only courses in the US. And a lot of that probably has to do with some of the increasing regulations for international students. For example, new international students generally are not allowed to enroll in solely online international education or online courses within the US. With so again,
Uh-oh. Bryce, it might help. I don't know how your phone, what your phone connection
Mhm.
is, but it might improve audio quality if you join via your phone. I don't know if that's an option for you.
I could. It might take me a moment though.
Yeah,
So
yeah, that would be the only problem. I'm not sure if we can move on from here realistically or not.
yeah, I can continue on, or we can switch over to the panel, whatever you prefer, Melanie.
If you think you don't have too many more slides, maybe we can try to continue on.
Okay.
Yeah.
Because I think this is really, really interesting data and I want to share it with everyone.
Sure, absolutely. And if I do cut out, we can maybe try to come back to it. But let me see if I can finish.
Okay,
And
we'll
if
try one
we
more
have
time.
trouble again, maybe we'll move on to the panel. I apologize for that. And then we also asked prospective students about what some of their other plans might be if they cannot do a traditional U.S. program if they couldn't do a traditional program this fall, whether it was online or online for just the fall term or in person or a hybrid of the two. So we asked them if they, some of the options we gave them were not pursuing higher education, enrolling in a fully online degree program, so the entire degree program is online, studying in another country or postponing. With international students, which are the green bar, they're most interested actually in postponing enrollment in a U.S. institution, which I think is actually very good news for U.S. institutions. So I think for U.S. colleges and universities, one of the things to think about, particularly as we head beyond the fall term and into next year, as far as the pandemic is continuing and any restrictions along with that, is to really think about helping students to defer their enrollment if need be. With immigrant students, which are the blue bar, they are very strongly interested, if they can't do a regular program, in doing just a fully online degree program. So that's something to consider as well. There were some international students who were interested in other countries. By far the biggest, when we asked them, or the one of most interest was Canada, followed by a lot of the other English-speaking countries, the UK, Australia, etc. And then the other group of questions that we asked about were barriers and concerns. So the first was, we asked higher education institutions, what are some of the top concerns that you have about international students coming because of COVID-19? And by far and away, it was visa issues and travel restrictions, which I'm sure comes as no surprise to many. Roughly about 3/4 of institutional respondents said those two things. Nearly half also were concerned about the social and political environment in the US. When we asked students themselves, we asked them separately about visa and travel issues, but when we asked them about some economic and social issues, just the general economic situation in both the US and in countries around the world was an issue for them. And then after that, it diverges a little bit between international students and immigrants, but other top concerns were the ability to get a job, either during or after their study, as well as the general openness of US society to international students and immigrants. And then we did also ask them about visa issues and travel. Over half of, and this is just toward prospective international students who are outside of the US, over half of them said they were extremely concerned about securing a visa and entering the US. And of course, that's due to a number of things, some of the impacts of the pandemic on US embassies and consulates and their ability to issue visas on time, but also a lot of the travel restrictions in coming into the US, particularly from certain countries. The CDC, for example, mentions restrictions to this date on countries such as Brazil, China, and a lot of countries in Europe. The other issue of concern, nearly half of international students in August were concerned about their health and that of their family if they were accompanying in traveling to the US and the possibility of contracting COVID-19. And then just the very last thing was, in June, we decided to also ask about the social and political environment with, I think everyone knows about everything going on in addition to the pandemic this year. It's been a very eventful year. And so we wanted to ask kind of how that's impacting their interest in the US as well. We ask it at a very general level. We aren't really able to disaggregate it by the various things going on in the US, including, for example, the upcoming presidential election. But we did find that from June to August, there was a slight uptick in those who are less interested in the US because of some of the social and political environmental factors. Doesn't necessarily mean they won't come here, but it is something that's a little bit of a detraction for some of them. And then the next largest number said that there was no impact at around a little over a quarter in August. And then I'm just going to leave you with a few recommendations based on what we found in this particular research. One is that despite all of the challenges going on, US education still seems to be pretty attractive to a lot of international students around the world. And so I think it's still a good thing to continue to promote not only the value of your institution and your specific programs that you offer that make your institution unique, but about the value of US higher education overall. Another one is to really engage in backyard recruitment if that's something you haven't done much of to date. And this refers, of course, to international students as well as immigrant students who are already in the US and don't face the same restrictions with getting a visa for the first time or with traveling here from another country despite the restrictions and so forth. A lot of these students are interested and they're already here and they don't face the same barriers that those who are outside of the US do. I didn't get a chance to get into this presentation, but when you break the results down by different countries of origin, you definitely see different levels of interest depending on where students come from. And so to targeting your recruitment very specifically, I think is going to be important. One thing I would say, for example, is that institutions have always traditionally relied very heavily on China when it comes to international student recruitment. We do see some of their interest declining a little bit, I think for just a whole variety of different factors. Interestingly, in our research, we found that African students, particularly, for example, Nigerian students, Ghanaian students, really highly interested in coming to the US, even in the spite of any challenges. And that might be, and I think at least in the longer term future, that's going to be a really great area of the world to focus on for recruitment. And then the last one I would say is, if you and your institution have found that there are restrictions that are, policy restrictions, regulations that are coming out that are really negatively impacting your international students, your immigrants, we've found recently that coordination among higher education institutions and the sector in general really seems to help with that. Of course, it doesn't always guarantee a good outcome, but we've seen really strong coordination and action within the sector really help against certain regulations that are coming out. And I would point people, of course, to different organizations such as NAFSA and the President's Alliance on Higher Education and Immigration to look at some of those resources. And you can access this research. We hope to have it out by the end of October. You can either get it directly on the website where we release our research, so west.org/research, or through our online newsletter, which is WENR, and you can go to wenr.west.org. If you subscribe to any of our newsletters, it will be emailed out to you once the research itself is actually released. And if you would like to contact me, if you have any other questions beyond this webinar, feel free to reach out at research.west.org. And Melanie, I'm going to turn it back over to you. We made it.
We made it. That's great. Whatever bumps there were, they're gone now. So smooth sailing. Thanks so much for that, Bryce. That was really excellent data, and I think it highlights a little bit of hope for many of us, and I think that's really excellent. I would love now to move into our panel to talk a little bit about the institutional experiences and how they relate to the data that Bryce has shared. Certainly the COVID-19 impact has been disruptive for education at all levels across the globe. And so I'd like to ask our institutional colleagues, what did your fall intake look like? What are the numbers? Were they as good or as bad as you anticipated? And what were some of the things that you did over the summer to mitigate impact, and what was most effective? And I think we will start with Stacy from FIU.
Thank you, Melanie. So we did a lot of things when we were starting to look at what fall intake was actually going to look like. The first thing that we had really already taken into consideration for our graduate programs at the university as a whole was we were actually losing some of our students from Kuwait due to an influx of students that we had in the past couple of years. So we had already prepared ourselves to have a little bit of a lower number than what we were expecting. For the university as a whole, at the undergraduate level, we were down by about 25 to 30%. Within the graduate school of business, which is where I am housed, we were down about 50%, but that 50% is based on the number of students. And we were actually within our enrollment percentage that we see within our normal years. So we were still within that same range. It was just last year we had a very large number of international students. Things that we did to really work on making sure that we did have this enrollment, we were communicating with our students nonstop. As soon as we knew what was happening, we were sending out emails pretty much weekly on what was going on with the university, what our next steps were going to be. And we did make as many accommodations for students as we could for deferrals, for visa processing times and delays of arrival. And we also offered remote and in-person learning at a hybrid level so that students could take classes from their home countries if they chose to do so. And about 10% of our students did choose that.
Keela, maybe, can you maybe share some thoughts from your campus?
Yes, thanks. So we did pretty well as well with our fall numbers. We also have a pretty significant summer intake, and that's where we saw a little bit more decrease in students, just students that weren't able to get here because things were so close to kind of the spring where everything shut down. But for fall, we got about 80% of our international students in an active kind of status where they're able to have some students on campus. We also did a hybrid model as well to promote students being able to complete their degree programs from overseas. And then we have a large number of students from China. So we worked with a partner in China to have an on-campus experience in China for new students, and as well as continuing students. And so we have one going in Beijing and one going in Shanghai as well. So we were able to kind of improve our odds there with maintaining connections with students, and then just all of the increase in communication that happened, over the summer and even towards the tail end of the spring semester to do all we can to maintain the connection.
Stacy?
Okay, yeah, sorry. My mute button wouldn't unmute. So for those of you that aren't familiar with Montgomery College, we are a very large community college outside of Washington, D.C. in Maryland. And overall, our enrollment, I don't think was too bad considering what was happening. Our general enrollment is down for fall, maybe about 5%. When we look at applications from our international students, that was also down about 5% compared to last fall, which considering was not too bad. Now, most of those students have not registered yet. We weren't able to get too many people into the country, but it speaks to Bryce's data from West that there is an interest, there continues to be an interest. We're still getting applications for spring, even for next fall. So students want to come. So I think that's the good news. I would echo what both Keela and Stacy said that, communication was essential. One-on-one communication, outreach at every step of the way made a big difference for helping students on board. We really, and then for our continuing students, we didn't see much of a drop at all for those international students. They stayed and they've been able to remain enrolled. We went completely online. With the exception of a very small handful of labs that just needed some sort of hybrid on-campus option, but everything has been primarily remote and something that they've called structured remote. So we've got distance learning that is completely online, and then the structured remote, which meets at particular synchronous times as if it were a classroom option. So far so good, and we're hopeful for the spring.
Great. Leah, I'm curious what you have heard from your NAIA aspect, how it's impacted athletics, and maybe some of your overall thoughts.
Yeah, so from an athletics standpoint, the hybrid learning, the virtual learning, that pivot that's been able to be made so well on the education side is obviously a massive challenge on the athletics front. We you know, our lifeblood is the competition that actually occurs in person. So we've seen a pretty substantial, more so than it sounds like the other panelists, in terms of our numbers coming through as new applicants towards our eligibility center, which is required for student athletes to get eligible to get cleared at one of our 250 member institutions. And I will say the NAI is really focused around small college athletics. So it could be possible that this is really also just something that's impacting our four-year, largely private institutions that are of smaller enrollments. But we're at about 58% decrease in the total numbers of international students who are starting an application brand new, about 40% down in terms of the students who are paying for their application fee, and about 30% down in the numbers of students getting an actual decision to compete at one of our member schools. So I think no matter how you swing it, I think that's probably a larger impact than what I heard any of you mentioning. You know, as we have been speaking with our folks that are kind of boots on the ground in international countries, you know, one of the residual things that we've heard, it's kind of ancillary, that's not top of mind when we think about the pandemic, is things like the dollar to the dollar ratio. So our Brazilian cohort has really taken a pretty big impact. So starting in March, the reais to dollar ratio is something like $1 to 3.3 reais, and now it's $1 to 5.6. That was in October, the last time that we checked. So the Brazilian parents even are finding it a much harder proposition to even make the fees that they would ordinarily be able to afford. So that's kind of an ancillary thing that I think is going on behind the scenes. But just like the data that you showed, Bryce, we're certainly hearing the same thing in terms of interest. Athletics is really an amazing experience in the US. We really have the only model that really provides this platform to student athletes to be both a student and an athlete, receive scholarships, and compete at a really high level. So interest has not gone away whatsoever. I think that bodes well for the future, but in the meantime, we are certainly seeing impacts. From a mitigation standpoint, to your point, Melanie, you know, we kind of play an interesting role. We're the national governing body. We're not boots on the ground, like you know, the people who are actually doing the recruiting. So our role was more in terms of the structure and the administration of how we were going to think about NAI competitions and start dates, and were we going to postpone our championships? Were we going to, you know, we were more on the admin side of it. So we definitely know that we tried to take a flexible approach. So we have a couple prongs. Eligibility is one of them, but we said right out of the gate, we have to make concessions, changes, and make this as easy as possible. So things like the test scores that were impacted, seasons of competition, we erred on the side of complete leniency in terms of eligibility rules. If you had asked me about a year ago if I ever thought that we would be in this boat where so many rules in college athletics were just thrown out the window in one fell swoop, I never would have believed that's possible. But our committees and the folks that govern the rules overseeing our organization, but as well as even the NCAA and NJCAA, everyone across the board has really taken a flexible approach. I think it helped. I think that could have contributed to student athletes remaining interested and being able to get to campuses because eligibility basically just became a non-hurdle. But the other thing that we did was we were trying to say, you know, we really need to be flexible with our approach to the competitions also. So our member institutions had a lot of autonomy around whether or not to postpone, whether or not to participate in the fall season. And so we've moved all of our championships to the spring, which is going to make for a really interesting February to May endeavor. But, you know, we mostly just hope that we get the opportunity to really tackle having 27 championships within the course of a mere couple of weeks. I would say that the hybrid model, so when schools were announcing going hybrid or going full online, we saw that was having an impact. International students wanted to be face-to-face, they wanted to be in person. Because if you're an athlete, that's what you're wanting to do. So we saw that as a factor, and obviously the delayed postponement of seasons. was a tremendous factor for students making the choice to come, for athletes specifically. There were some other considerations that did make things challenging, at least in the beginning. We were trying to figure out, what do we do if students can't get their transcripts? From an admission standpoint, you could admit contingently and then kind of on the back end, make sure and validate. We don't have that flexibility from an eligibility standpoint because we're kind of the clearinghouse. They have to get through us to get to campus. So we don't have any mechanism in place to sort of like let them in and then check it later. So we had to grapple with that, and I think that could have been a little bit of a hurdle for some students. And you know, if their school was closed as an example, that became a little bit challenging for them too. But all in all, I do think that the future looks bright in terms of interest, and like the data, Bryce, you were showing, you know, if so many students delayed their enrollment, we're considering the possibility that there's a real influx that's going to hit us in, you know, whether it be this spring. I don't think it'll happen this spring. I think it's more likely to happen the following fall. So that we're kind of preparing for data models that help us staff and figure out how to manage an influx. Of course, in this day and age, that's a problem we would love to have. I'll turn it back over to you, Melanie.
Absolutely. Thanks, Leah. That's really interesting. Building on the hopeful measure and looking ahead at a hopeful future, I'm curious what everyone's recruitment plans and yield plans for the spring and then the fall look like. Maybe I'll ask Stacy from Maryland to start.
Sure. So I suspect, like many community colleges, we don't have a strong strategy for international recruitment or a budget for international recruitment. So much of what we do focuses on, as Bryce described it, that backyard recruitment strategies. Students, we have a large international student population at Montgomery College. But they really find us because of our location being so close to Washington, D.C. And then they find us through friends and family in the area. So it's not been a big need for us to really focus on international recruitment specifically. But what I think this time has really elevated for us is the importance of collaboration and partnerships. We are a member of the Maryland International Education Consortium, and the recruitment arm of that is Study Maryland. And so if you have those study state initiatives in your state, they're a great resource. Through that partnership, we are able to participate in virtual college fairs, building relationships with partners throughout the world. Professional development opportunities locally. We have a virtual fair coming up in a couple of weeks for transfer students within the state of Maryland, for international transfer students. So that's been a really rich opportunity. And I think it's also let us think long-term about building relationships, using social media differently, some of those tools that perhaps we didn't leverage quite as much as we did previously. And then relying on other tools like virtual campus tours, and the outreach, and really working through the contacts that we already have.
Very good.
Yeah, and similar to what Stacy said, FIU is also a part of the Study Florida Consortium. So we've been leveraging that along with our other partnerships. Speaking particularly to our Graduate School of Business, we've been relying a lot on our international recruitment agent partners. We have a vast network of agents that we work with worldwide, and we've been doing webinars and meeting them in their space. And we've realized that there's a lot more flexibility and a lot more willingness to be meeting online now than there was in the past. We've also really leveraged a lot of our dual degree and partnership programs that we have with outside universities for articulation agreements. We've established some new agreements during this time as well to really make sure that we do have this continued footprint and broadening our footprint even from what we normally had in the past. And we're also kind of looking at where our previous recruitment efforts were and what worked and what didn't, and watching what's changing because the world is changing. And the flexibility of students to travel. China is one of our major markets, and we know there's still a lot of difficulties with travel from China. So we are looking into other regions to pick up the slack where we're losing it in certain places.
Excellent. So let's talk a little bit about the immigration aspects in this. There's an underlying current of U.S. immigration pieces. What do we know? What are we hearing? What are we seeing? And I'm going to ask Keela to talk a little bit about that.
So we don't have a lot of time, so I'll try to make this as quick as possible. We kind of went through, well, not kind of, but we did go through a lot of significant changes and recommendations from the Department of Homeland Security, specifically the Student and Exchange Visitor Program, which is the organization that sets requirements for our international students in the F1 and J1 visa status. So in the spring, we had the quick adjustment, realizing that a lot of campuses were going to need to close down, the open allowance for distance education classes, but then we also had the restrictions as airports or airlines were restricting flights and shutting down, visa offices were closing. And so our students found it very difficult to even depart the US. And then we have the U.S. Citizenship and Immigration Services in the U.S. that processes applications. So students that are applying for post-graduation work authorization known as optional practical training, those were taking quite a bit of time because USCIS was shut down. And so we have the situation where some students were beyond their time period that they were allowed to stay, and the advice and change in advice around that. And then we have some very restrictive guidance that came out over the summer in July that was for the fall semester that was not going to allow students to be inside the US studying completely online, among other things. And then we have all of the travel bans that came out that restricted students from even being able to enter the US from different countries, as Bryce mentioned earlier. And so thankfully that summer guidance was revised to be a little bit more flexible and in line with the spring guidance that we were given. So schools that are operating in an online format or hybrid format could have students that were able to make it to campus to get to campus. And then we have the quarantines that are in place that would require a student to quarantine for 14 days outside the US before they could enter the US. And so that restricted a lot of travel. And the backlog in the visa processing really hurt a lot of our international students being able to arrive to our campuses. So even if they had a visa appointment, we had quite a few students whose appointments were being canceled, the day of or very soon when they were supposed to have their appointments and were not able to arrive. And we have students that were supposed to be arriving for the fall having appointments, this month and next month, in hopes of trying to arrive for the spring semester. For us, we also experienced an increase in our international students being scammed. So this environment is ripe for scamming as those, I'm gonna say criminals, reach out to students who are desperate and trying to figure out what's going on with their status and, convince them to, give them money or whatever. And so we had a lot of increased communication that we were sending out about what to look out for with scams. Our campus police division, thankfully, is very active in monitoring those cases and trying to assist students in working through who they need to be communicating with if they gave out personal information. And we have coming forward, right now there's an open comment period, and I can put a link in the chat in just a minute. I can't do that and talk, sorry. But there is a proposal from the Department of Homeland Security to eliminate the duration of status benefit. And there are a few other things in that proposal as well, but this is kind of a big effect on how international offices will operate, honestly. So duration of status is a benefit that allows students to remain in the US in their visa status as long as their school officials are able to keep their visa document active. And so students are not given a date by which they must depart when they enter the US, like a lot of other visa statuses are. They're given literally D/S for a duration of status. And then we as school officials can extend their stay as needed for students to complete their degree program. So the proposal is for that to be eliminated and for students to be given a date-specific time by which their status will expire. And the way for students to extend their status will be taken out of the international offices and put in the hands of the U.S. Citizenship and Immigration Services, which has already significant backlogs in their processing. And so there's a application that will need to be submitted with an application fee, and the U.S. Citizenship and Immigration Services is going to determine what evidence a student will need to submit to qualify for an extension of their status. And they've already mentioned that things that will not qualify for an extension of status include failing courses. And so you can imagine our students struggle academically for many different reasons, and that may be a reason for them to not be considered for an extension of their visa status. This will also require students who are applying for post-completion work authorization to have to file not only an application for that post-completion work authorization, but also an application to extend their status, because their status is going to expire at the point, that is provided by the government. And it will not be determined by the international office how much time the students get. It will be determined by the Customs and Border Protection agent when they're in the airport, how much time they get. So we've already had the question, well, Keela, can't you guys just enter the I-20s for whatever anyway? Well, sure, we can, but it won't determine what they actually get for their timeline for their status when they enter the US. And then there's, of course, with that, a proposal to open up the premium processing benefit so that students who desperately will need to apply to extend their status can pay the government thousands of dollars to do that application a little bit faster. So yes, I hope I covered a lot in that, but please, definitely let me know if you have any questions. And I'll put the public comment period is open until October 26th, and I'll put that link in here, and anyone can comment on this proposed change.
Thanks for that, Keela. I think that's a good reminder that it's important for all of us to be advocating on behalf of our students. So the last question I want to ask before we go into the Q&A is just a comment about, we've talked about recruitment. Can we just talk a little bit about retention? And I know that some folks have mentioned it, but what are you seeing on your campus with your pre-pandemic international student populations? Are you retaining them? What are you seeing and expecting for the spring? Do you have concerns? And before we go to our institutions, I think Bryce might have a little bit of information to share on that from a more broad perspective.
Yeah, we did ask institutions for what they were doing back in June to help international students in this given climate. Now, this is more of a reaction to the spring semester than this current fall semester, but a lot of it, up to almost 3/4 of institutions were really focusing on helping students transition to learning online, right? So helping students with kind of online learning platforms, transitioning things like tutoring and writing center services online. But there was also expansions in things like mental health and counseling services, obviously really crucial in this current environment as well as to helping students with finding emergency housing if they suddenly lost their housing due to the pandemic and so forth. Those are just some of we asked quite a few, but those were some of the main ones that popped up.
So I would just echo everything that Bryce said. I mean, that certainly has played out on our campus. One of the big things is the financial situation of students, and so our foundation has been wonderful, providing support for students, emergency support with technology, books, fees. Where we can, there's been flexibility to try and eliminate any fees that we can. The mental health piece has also been a big part, so an increase in having support groups for students. Mobile markets, so we have a very robust food market program. We've got 3 campuses. At least once a month, they've got a large mobile market on each campus for students and community members alike. A couple weeks ago, they did one especially for our international students, and we had about 100 students register for that. So there's clearly a need for that sort of support, in addition to the academic supports that are happening. And I think back to what we talked about in the first question is that one-on-one the communication, the proactive outreach communication, trying where we can not to wait for students to contact us, but to have folks that are reaching out to students wherever they can. Because of course there is that fear that if we don't see them, we don't know what they need. And if they don't speak up and take that initiative, then who's helping them? And I think that's a big concern. I know that worries me quite a bit.
Yeah, and similar to Stacy, we were also able to leverage some scholarship funding for students that were affected, particularly entering into the summer intake or continuing into the summer term, and students that were continuing on into fall. There was some additional funding that we were able to pull for students who were directly impacted. We also did provide a lot of hand-holding and independent outreach. We contacted all of our students to find out what their status was, what their situation was, worked with them on a one-on-one basis to make sure that we were aware of their situation. We could work with them whatever status they were in, however they were currently enrolled. For students that had traveled or had originally, when we shut down in March, we had told all of our international students to go home. So because we didn't expect it to be 6 months later. So we did work with all of those students and try to get them back on our campus and make sure that we were able to provide whatever extensions we could, or leave of absence or temporary delays or whatever hardship cases we had. We typically don't allow students to start in our fall B semester, which is a mini term, but we did create that as an actual enrollment term this semester for students to allow them those extra 6 to 8 weeks to arrive back on campus in the event that they couldn't make it for August. We did everything that we could in our power to make sure that our students had options.
Thanks so much, Stacy. That's great. And both Stacys. And so we are now going to move into the Q&A section. And while we're waiting for folks, I think our panelists have been right on top of the Q&A and answering them. So that's fantastic. I may ask our panelists one question while we're kind of waiting to see if anything bubbles up from the audience. And that's really, I'm curious about deferrals. So we've had a lot of conversation around, in other forums, around students who deferred from fall to spring. And I'm curious if anyone has any experiences. What are you preparing for? What do you think is going to happen? What does it feel like on your campus?
Yeah, so within my department, we had about a 30% deferral rate for international students to fall 2021 and spring 2021. We're fortunate that the majority of our programs do have a spring intake, so we were able to provide them an option for that. And our university does allow a 1-year deferral for all applicants. So we did have that already in our policies and procedures. So it wasn't that we had to come up with a new practice. We were able just to continue this and make sure that our students and applicants were aware of this policy. We are starting to see more applicants come in for spring from those deferrals. And we actually extended our deferral deadline until the middle of September. So it's normally by the first day of classes, we gave them an extra 5 weeks. So it was great to have all of that additional time. And we're starting to see those students actually start to get visa appointments for spring and move forward. So we're hopeful.
That's great news. Anyone else have anything to share on that? Okay. All right.
From a deferment standpoint, that is really tough about athletics is that the roster sizes are the roster sizes. Mm-hmm. So one of the things we're considering is we gave a season of competition back for spring sports students who got their championships cut short. But we realize that there's residual impacts because now there's like super seniors at the same time that schools are trying to manage incoming freshmen and everybody wants playing time. And so one of the things that we have adjusted is the way in which we calculate for financial aid purposes, scholarshiping. So it's going to enable more people to be put in the game and not have that sort of count against the institution. But it's funny because we had actually already decided to make this change. It wasn't a pandemic pivot. It was after we had done an analysis already of how schools are sort of, they can get strapped when they're trying to manage rosters. But that's been a concern. So it's really been interesting because you've got students on one side of the fairness question saying, hey, don't charge me a season, because kids get 4. Don't use up one of my seasons if I got cut short. But then the kids coming in saying, well, that's not fair. When will I ever get to play? So it's really tough. And we're grappling now with, so far, we're not just giving everyone a blanket season for this fall. If they play in a certain number of games, it will count. But we don't, we just don't know what will happen. And so there is pressure, there will be pressure if we have to get to a place where championships are completely canceled. Knock on wood, I don't have to do that. We don't have to do that. But if we were in that boat, then we really have a problem, because we're going to have kids from last year, kids from this year. And unless we just create extra teams or something like that, it's going to be a challenge.
Yeah, for sure. The challenge has been real, and I want to commend everyone who is. I've been amazed at the stories that I'm hearing from my institutional colleagues and my association colleagues who are bending over backwards, trying to pivot and change and adapt in circumstances that change by the minute. And I think that this adaptation, all of this work, all of this flexibility, all of this managing of change is actually having an impact. I think that our students are seeing that we want them and they're still interested, and we're doing our best to get them. And so it's nice to see a little bit of a glimmer of hope that all of these efforts are paying off, and that's fantastic. So I think we're going to close. We are just about at time. I do want to say, actually, I saw one more Q&A come up. Actually, I have one question. I think it'll be short. Leah, do you think that sports will happen in spring?
Yeah, so they technically already are. Institutions are competing across the country, I will just say. If the question is more around the championships and whether like conferences can compete, or we can do March Madness, which is probably what they're really asking about, I don't know the answer to that. Right now, the NAI is fully committed and in full organization mode for having 27 championships within the construct of the spring term. And until we basically can't, or there are signals out there that we really shouldn't, that's the plan. I think everyone from a variety, we talked about mental health, but I think that that's another element to sports give people. And I think that, I mean, from top to bottom, everyone wants to be able to do sports if it's safe to do it. So I don't think I have a magic ball to know exactly what will happen in the spring, but I'm hopeful.
Thanks. It's nice to have hope, right? All right, well, we're going to close. If we can bring the slides back up, I want to say thank you very much to all of our presenters. This has been a great conversation, and I thank you for spending your time with us today. We know that despite the fact that you are working from home and you're incredibly busy, that you still need professional development. We are not doing in-person conferences in the near term, but our virtual calendar is packed, and so that I hope you will check the upcoming events on the Acro calendar. We've launched a new communication called This Month at Acro to share everything that we're planned, to make sure that you don't miss anything. But if you don't see that, our calendar on our website will have all of our activities. The next several coffee breaks are planned. The next one that we will have is on November 6th, and we're going to talk about test optional and implementing holistic admissions review. And it'll be a roundtable of practitioners. In a moment, I will also highlight the next mental health series webinars. But I want to point out that this week, we do have a new publication that will go with the test optional, and we have a new publication on holistic admissions, and that's available, or will be available, in the bookstore next week. So also I want to highlight our mental health series. So that's on the next slide. I've been struck with all of the folks that I have talked to who are institution-based have been really stretched, and we all could use a little bit of a mental health break. And so we have put together a series to support you all. I hope that you will take the time to hear about how to lead in a remote environment, to talk about battling burnout, to do a little bit of mindfulness with us, and to talk a little bit about personal and professional boundaries in this space where we're working and teaching in our homes. So we hope to see you there at one of our upcoming events in the next several weeks. Next slide. I'd like to also point out that October 28th to 30th is our Acrosem Conference, and this is going to be Acro's very first fully virtual conference. We have locked in early bird pricing, so we hope you'll join us. It is going to be a really great event. Our team has been working hard planning this for months, and I think you're going to be really surprised. We're really going to focus on crisis as the catalyst for transformation, because you know that everything that's been happening over the last several months is going to have a lasting impact and change the way we do business every day. Next slide. As a final reminder, if you need guidance that needs to be tailored specifically to your college or university, we hope that you will reach out to Acro Consulting for a convenient and affordable solution. We know right now that you need to deploy every possible tool in your toolbox to drive student enrollment success. Contact consulting at acro.org or complete the contact form on the website for more information. Thank you again for joining us. We hope you have a fantastic weekend, and I will see you online again soon.